Millionaire CEO regrets everything when Maid he left returns in a limo with his triplets. Welcome, beautiful souls. I'm so grateful to have you here today. Before we begin this unforgettable story, I want to send love and light your way. May your heart be at peace, your worries be light, and may joy find you wherever you are right now. May the story you're about to hear inspire healing, strength, and hope in your journey. Now tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it over there right now? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Let's dive into a tale of love, betrayal, strength, and redemption that will move your soul. Make sure to stay till the end, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The sprawling mansion of Ethan Cross, a sharp-suited 33-year-old millionaire CEO, known for his ruthless business instincts and emotionally distant demeanor, stood tall against the city skyline like a monument of cold success. Yet behind its lavish marble floors and designer walls was a silence that echoed louder than any applause he'd ever received. Into this world stepped Amara Bennett, a soft-spoken, warm-hearted young black woman with soulful eyes and braided hair that cascaded down her back like a river of resilience, hired quietly through a housekeeping agency with little fanfare. She was nothing like the previous staff who'd come and gone, their ambition outpacing their loyalty. Amara was different. She didn't see the mansion as a workplace, but as a place where dignity and care were needed, and she gave both freely. Her first morning, she arrived early, wore a simple navy uniform, and greeted the other staff with grace, though most brushed past her, uninterested in connection. She was assigned to oversee the personal quarters of Ethan's elderly mother, Margaret Cross, a frail woman battling early-stage dementia, often forgotten in the glitter of her son's empire. While others avoided Margaret's wing due to her unpredictable moods, Amara approached her with patience, compassion, and a gentle smile that somehow soothed the old woman's paranoia. She'd sit beside her each morning, brush her silver hair, read softly from her favorite novels, and sometimes even sing lullabies when the nights got too lonely. Margaret, who hadn't laughed in months, began smiling again sometimes, calling Amara "my angel," or gently squeezing her hand in quiet thanks. The mansion's cold corridors began to warm with her presence, though Ethan barely noticed her. He'd sweep in late from work, loosen his tie with a sigh, pour a scotch, and scroll through market reports while the world around him blurred. Still, without fail, Amara would place a fresh cup of coffee by his side within minutes of his return, the aroma always perfectly balanced to his liking, though he never asked how she knew. She learned his rhythms, not to please him but because she believed kindness should be invisible and honest. Every evening, she removed his shoes, never out of servitude, but as a quiet act of grace. She'd fold his coat, tidy his briefcase, and retreat with the poise of someone who respected boundaries, even when others crossed them. Though unnoticed, her presence began to soften the edges of the home. The flowers stayed fresh. The rooms always had a faint scent of vanilla, and Ethan's mother, once forgotten, now waited by the window each day just to hear Amara's footsteps. The mansion's other staff started whispering about her, some with admiration, others with jealousy. But Amara never responded to gossip. She came from a place where dignity was worn like armor, where silence could speak volumes, and where love didn't demand an audience. Her laughter, though rare, was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and even the mansion's lifeless garden seemed to bloom more often when she passed by. Ethan, ever focused on his company's next acquisition, didn't realize that the woman brewing his coffee and caring for his mother was gently reshaping the soul of his home. One evening, Margaret had a minor panic episode, crying out for her late husband. While other staff stood frozen, Amara held her close, whispered calming words, and stayed with her all night, earning a rare, tearful kiss on the cheek from the elderly woman. Ethan was told about the incident the next morning. He simply nodded, distracted, barely offering thanks. But that night, when he returned from work, something in the air felt different, warmer, calmer, as though the mansion itself had taken a breath. Amara saw the fatigue in his eyes, handed him his coffee without a word, and this time Ethan paused. Their eyes met for the first time as boss and maid, but as two human beings holding quiet storms. The moment passed quickly, but it lingered with him longer than he expected. Days passed, and Amara continued her quiet routine, smoothing bedsheets, whispering prayers for the lonely, helping Margaret eat slowly and with dignity, and retreating to her small servants' quarters each night without complaint. One afternoon, when the chef quit abruptly, it was Amara who cooked dinner for the entire staff, a cornbread and roasted rosemary chicken becoming an instant legend. Even Ethan noticed the taste and asked his assistant who prepared it, only to be told it was just the maid. That night, he found himself wondering what her name was. Amara never asked for anything. Not praise, not attention. She merely gave. When Margaret had a nightmare, it was Amara who cradled her. When the mansion's power failed during a thunderstorm, it was Amara who lit candles and sang softly to keep everyone calm. One day, she saw Ethan staring at an old family photo in the hallway, his jaw clenched and eyes hollow. She didn't speak, only placed a glass of water near him and left silently, her presence like a soothing breeze. And for the first time in years, Ethan whispered, "Thank you," to someone without sarcasm. But what truly stirred something inside him was when he overheard Margaret speaking to a nurse. "If only my son had half the heart that girl has." That sentence repeated in his mind for days like a haunting melody. As weeks turned into months, Ethan began to notice her more. The way she tucked her braids with grace, the way she knelt to pick up a fallen spoon without pride or shame, the way she hummed a hymn while wiping dust from the window pane. It was all beautiful, not flashy, not loud, just deeply, naturally beautiful. He didn't yet know it, but the foundation of his soul loan, built on ambition, numbers, and solitude, was beginning to crack in the presence of a woman who had nothing to give but everything to offer. And in the quietness of that mansion, surrounded by wealth he thought could buy anything, Ethan Cross was about to learn what priceless really meant. The rain outside poured like a lullaby from the heavens, soft thunder rolling across the darkening sky as the mansion settled into its usual silence, unaware that fate was tiptoeing toward a moment neither heart inside it could undo. Amara, returning late from an errand Margaret had requested, stepped into Ethan's personal suite to tidy up before retiring for the night, unaware he had returned home an hour earlier than usual. Her uniform clung damply to her skin from the rain, and feeling uncomfortable, she reached into the linen closet for one of the guest robes, but instead found a silky red nightgown folded neatly, clearly intended for a high-end guest. It was soft, dry, and she, in her innocence, saw no harm in using it just briefly while she freshened up. She slipped into it, the silk hugging her curves with elegance she didn't mean to show off, and entered the marble-tiled bathroom where warm steam quickly fogged the mirror and carried the scent of her rose oil into the air. Water cascaded over her shoulders as she closed her eyes, humming softly, unaware that destiny was already turning the knob of the bathroom door. Ethan, soaked and irritated from the storm, didn't bother calling Uthis mind, too tangled in contracts and deadlines. He stepped into the bathroom, tugging at his tie, then froze as if lightning had struck the tiles. Time paused. Before him stood Amara, wrapped in crimson silk, her back glistening under the golden light, her long braids heavy with water, her shoulders relaxed in a vulnerable peace he had never witnessed before. His breath caught, not out of lust, but a deeper pull that seized something buried beneath years of loneliness. Amara turned slowly, her eyes widening in horror, her voice trapped somewhere between apology and shame. "Two didn't know you were back, sir," she whispered, her arms crossing her chest in shock. But Ethan didn't move. He stared, not with disrespect, but as though he had stumbled upon something sacred, something raw and rare, and meant to be hidden. His heart thundered louder than the rain, and words escaped his lips before he even realized they belonged to him. "You're beautiful," he said softly, almost in disbelief. Amara's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but it was the gentleness in his tone that confused her the most. She had worked beside him for months, always as the shadow behind the service, but never once had she imagined he could see her like this, vulnerable, soft, womanly. "Sir, please, this isn't right," she stammered, stepping back, her bare feet skimming the cool tiles. But Ethan didn't lunge or leer. He stepped forward slowly, as if afraid he might startle her out of the room. "I love you, sweetheart," he whispered, the words tumbling out of his mouth like a confession meant for the night alone to witness. "I don't care what the world thinks. You're mine now." Amara's knees trembled not from fear, but from the collision of desire and disbelief. "Please," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I'm your maid. You don't mean this." But Ethan's eyes bore into hers, unblinking, steady, filled with something that was neither impulse nor performance. "You're not just a maid," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of truth. "You've been the only soul who ever made this house feel like home. You care for my mother more than I ever could. You've poured more love into this place than all the millions I've thrown at it. How could I not love you?" Amara stood still, torn between reality and the part of her heart that longed to believe him. Her breath hitched as he gently took her hands, his touch warm, firm, not possessive but reverent. "Let me show you," he whispered. "Let me prove that this isn't a mistake. I don't want a fling, want a forever. I want you." Her heart beat so loudly she thought the walls could hear it. For a moment, everything else a job, the rules, the hierarchy melted under the intensity of his gaze. No man had ever spoken to her like this, not as a servant, not as an accessory, but as someone worthy of devotion. "Ethan," she finally said, testing the sound of his name for the first time on her tongue. It didn't feel wrong, it felt terrifyingly real. She looked down, overwhelmed, unsure whether to run or surrender. "If you're lying, you'll destroy me." He shook his head and leaned in, his forehead gently resting against hers. "I swear on everything I have. You are the woman I've been too blind to see until now." The night air shifted, and something fragile, yet unbreakable, passed between them. A kind of unspoken agreement written in heartbeats instead of ink. Outside, thunder rolled once more, but inside, two worlds quietly collided in the sanctuary of the mist-filled room. Amara, wrapped in silk and trembling emotion, let out a long breath as Ethan cupped her cheek, kissing her forehead with reverence. That moment, gentle, unhurried, felt like a prayer. She knew nothing would ever be the same again. As the warmth of Ethan's forehead rested gently against hers, and the silence between them wrapped tighter than the steam that filled the bathroom, Amara felt her walls slowly surrender not to weakness, but to the weight of a man's voice that finally spoke to her heart, not her status. Her hesitation wasn't born from fear, but from the pain of wondering if this moment was real or just a beautiful illusion destined to vanish at dawn. Yet something in Ethan's trembling fingertips, something in the sincerity of his breath, told her this wasn't lust, it was longing, the kind that had waited too long to be noticed. Without saying another word, he lifted her hand, placed a reverent kiss on the back of it, and led her quietly into the softly lit bedroom, where the rain continued tapping gently against the wide glass windows like the heartbeat of the night itself. Amara's mind swirled with questions, but her soul quieted them all as Ethan knelt beside her, not as a millionaire, not as a boss, but as a man stripped of power, offering only his bare truth. He didn't rush or demand. He listened to her silences, responded to her stillness, and adored every breath she allowed him to share. The red silk gown clung to her like poetry, and his hands moved not with hunger, but with awe, tracing the curve of her arms like he was reading verses God had written into her skin. He kissed her shoulder with a reverence that made her gasp, not from surprise, but from the realization that this kind of intimacy didn't feel like crossing a line, but coming home. As they lay together, their bodies tangled under soft linen and soft light, the room bloomed with tenderness. Ethan whispered things he'd never said aloud, how he feared being alone, how he carried guilt for ignoring his mother, how Amara's presence had stitched together parts of his soul he didn't know were torn. Amara, in return, told him how invisible she'd felt all her life, how every glance from a man came with a price, but never value. That night, nothing about them was hidden. The walls between them melted, and the night became an altar, where their hearts made sacred vows, that words hadn't caught up to yet. When dawn peeked through the curtains, Amara woke first, cradled in Ethan's arms, her cheek against his bare chest where she could hear his steady heartbeat, like a lullaby she never knew she needed. He stirred soon after, smiling with a kind of peace that made her feel like she belonged not as an object, but as someone irreplaceable. As he dressed for work, he turned back, pulled her gently into his embrace, and placed a long kiss on her forehead that lingered long after he left the room. From that day forward, things changed. Ethan began coming home earlier, sometimes with flowers in hand, sometimes just with stories from his day that he'd never shared with anyone else. Each morning, he would find her in the kitchen and kiss her slowly, before leaving no longer out of routine, but as if she were the last good thing he didn't want to let go of. Amara started cooking meals only for him, even when the house chef was around. He began requesting she accompany him on short errands, introducing her subtly to parts of his world not meant for a maid. Their laughter echoed through hallways that once heard only footsteps. Ethan started leaving her handwritten notes, calling her "my light," and slipping them under her door at night, like a teenager discovering love for the first time. Amara kept them all tucked into a little book she hid beneath her pillow. Slowly, her uniform felt unnecessary. She started wearing soft dresses Ethan sent her, not to change her, but to honor the beauty he saw in her naturally. His mother, Margaret, noticed the glow in Amara's eyes and smiled more often, even teasing Ethan once by saying, "She makes you human again." Amara's heart began weaving dreams with golden thread dreams of a wedding on a garden terrace, of a life where she wasn't waiting at the edges, but standing in the center of love. She imagined walking into events beside Ethan, not behind him. She pictured a ring on her finger not for display, but as a symbol that someone saw her worth beyond the dust she swept. She stopped doubting his intentions, because his every action now whispered permanence. Ethan shared details of his childhood, opened old boxes of photographs, and asked her which picture of his father should stay on his office desk. He included her in conversations about his future plans, and Amara started believing she wasn't dreaming anymore. This was becoming real. Every day she waited eagerly for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, her heart skipping, as if she were still 16. He would walk in, loosen his tie, wrap his arms around her waist, and spin her around like the world didn't exist outside their orbit. They danced in the kitchen, slow danced in the hallway, and once even fell asleep on the living room floor after watching old black and white movies. On rainy nights, he'd hold her close by the fireplace, tracing circles on her skin as if memorizing her existence. He told her he wanted children one day, that he imagined her as the mother of them, calm, warm, loving. She blushed at the thought, never knowing that life would bring it sooner than either of them expected. Amara stopped seeing herself as a maid and started seeing herself as someone deeply loved, maybe not yet titled as wife, but embraced as the woman who mattered more than titles. Her days now began with smiles and ended with whispered, "I love yous." She caught herself humming love songs while folding laundry, and sometimes stood before the mirror, holding a hairbrush like a microphone, practicing her future name, Amara Cross. In those soft, stolen moments, she believed she was finally living a love story not written by someone else, but one she was writing line by line with the man who had once passed her by like furniture and now kissed her like a prayer. She had no idea the storm that was brewing in the distance, but tonight she was safe in his arms. And for now, that was everything. The nights still held magic, and the mornings still opened with Ethan's kisses pressed against Amara's forehead. But somewhere in the pauses between his words and the sudden shifts in his eyes, a quiet tension began to thread itself through the golden blanket of love they'd wrapped around each other. As the weeks passed, Amara's heart, once cautious and skeptical, had bloomed fully with trust, allowing herself to imagine a life where she would no longer be introduced as a servant, but as a wife, his wife. She began folding linens with a smile, humming soft melodies while glancing at her finger where no ring yet existed, but where her dreams had already placed one. It was during a gentle Sunday morning, as they sat on the back porch, sipping fresh coffee with the sunlight painting patterns across Ethan's cheeks, that she finally asked, with quiet hope trembling in her voice, When will we get married? Ethan didn't flinch, his smile remained. His fingers still lightly traced circles on her hand, but his eyes turned distant, clouded with something she couldn't name. Soon, sweetheart, he said, brushing a kiss across her knuckles. Just works a little crazy right now. Once things settle, I'll make it official. His voice was soft, loving, convincing, but inside, a storm of doubt thrashed violently against his ribs. Amara nodded, trusting him, her faith in his love unshaken. She understood busy seasons. She'd seen how hard he worked, how late his meetings ran, how often he paced the study floor whispering numbers into his phone. But what she didn't know was that Ethan, though wrapped around her soul every night, battled a war within himself every day. In the solitude of his office, behind polished doors and million-dollar decisions, he stared at her picture on his phone and asked questions he hated himself for thinking. What will the world say? What will the board think? How will the press spin this? The world had known Ethan Cross as the polished billionaire, the perfect bachelor in tailored suits, often seen with socialites and CEOs, not a maid, not a woman who arrived at his mansion with second-hand shoes and humble eyes. The truth was, Ethan adored Amara, needed her like breath, but the shadow of judgment loomed large in the corners of his mind, whispering that love might cost him the empire he built. And so, he smiled through the guilt. He whispered, soon, with tenderness, while hiding the fear that soon might never come. Amara, blissfully unaware, began collecting bridal ideas in a hidden notebook, sketching her dream dress during her lunch breaks, imagining Margaret's proud tears as she'd walk down the aisle. Her love was pure-rooted in belief, nourished by Ethan's soft gestures, and blooming under the illusion that everything they shared was leading to forever. She started telling the staff less about her feelings, guarding her joy like a secret too sacred to be doubted. She didn't notice how Ethan had started avoiding conversations about the future, how his embrace had become just a little shorter, his calls from the office a little longer. She mistook his growing restlessness for pressure at work, not knowing that beneath his polished exterior, he was entertaining meetings with a publicist about maintaining his image, and his assistant had already scheduled him to appear at a gala with someone more suitable. Each time Ethan looked at Amara asleep in his bed, her braids spread across his chest, her hand clutched to his heart, like she was anchoring herself to him. Guilt carved into him like a blade. He wasn't ready to give her up, but he wasn't ready to fight for her either. He existed in a cruel in-between, where love was real but fear louder. Amara began noticing the slight shift show. He turned away when she spoke about wedding songs, how he changed the subject when she showed him a magazine's engagement ring page. Still, she held on, whispering to herself that patience was love's language. One night, as they sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker like scattered stars, she rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "You're everything I prayed for." And in that moment, Ethan felt like the worst man alive. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, not to comfort her, but to quiet the screaming voice inside that knew he was building a dream on a lie. That night, he held her closer than usual, kissed her forehead more times than normal, and made love to her like he was trying to apologize without saying a word. She thought it meant they were closer than ever. He thought it meant he still had time to figure out what to do. But time was never kind to those who lied to love. And while Amara lay asleep beside him, whispering his name in her dreams, Ethan lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the man she believed in truly existed or if he had already failed her without her even knowing. The morning sun poured through the window like melted gold, spilling across the sheets where Amara lay curled beside Ethan, her hand gently resting over her belly, unaware that life had already begun to bloom inside her. A wave of nausea rolled over her as she tried to stand, but she brushed it off as fatigue and tiptoed into the kitchen to prepare Ethan's breakfast. But halfway through slicing strawberries, a sharp, stabbing pain tore through her abdomen, stealing the air from her lungs and buckling her knees beneath her. The tray crashed to the floor, and with a muffled cry, she collapsed, her forehead striking the cold marble tiles as her vision blurred. House staff scrambled, shouting for help, and Ethan, rushing down in his robe, Heart-pounding, scooped her into his arms and drove her to the hospital, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to ignore the fear clawing at his chest. Amara drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering his name like a fading prayer. At the hospital, doctors rushed her into an examination room while Ethan paced the hallway, running his fingers through his hair, his mind a chaotic storm of worry, confusion, and guilt. Moments later, a doctor emerged with a clipboard and a calm smile. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "Your wife is pregnant." For a split second, time stood still. The word pregnant echoed in Ethan's ears like a gunshot, but it was wife that snapped something inside him. His eyes darted to the nurse behind the doctor, then back at the clipboard, as if trying to erase what had just been spoken. Then came the words, cold, sharp, irreversible. "She's not my wife, she's my maid." The words spilled from his lips like poison, unfiltered, automatic, and instantly deadly. In that sterile white hallway, with fluorescent lights humming above and sterile floors gleaming below, Amara, hooked up to fourths, just behind the curtain, heard every syllable, her breath caught in her throat as if the oxygen had turned to stone. The man who had kissed her every morning, who had called her his queen, who had whispered promises into her skin, had just denied her with surgical precision, stripping her of every title her heart had dared to dream. She didn't move, she didn't cry. She simply lay still, the monitor beside her beeping in rhythm, with a soul quietly shattering. By the time she gathered the strength to sit up, Ethan was already gone. No goodbye, no apology. Just vanished like a ghost, leaving behind a broken memory. Her phone trembled in her palm as she called him again and again, each ring mocking her, until the final call went straight to voicemail. His phone powered off, his silence louder than any scream. The nurse returned with a soft smile, unaware of the damage already done. "You're about 5 weeks along," she said gently, placing a folder in Amara's lap. "The baby looks healthy," but Amara couldn't speak, couldn't even look the nurse in the eye. She felt hollow-like. Her body had become both a cradle and a grave, holding life in her womb while her heart died in real time. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the sonogram photo, her eyes filling with tears she refused to release. "He left me," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone in the room. "He loved me last night and left me this morning." Her voice cracked like glass under pressure. Her mind replayed the doctor's words. "Your wife is pregnant, Townd." And then Ethan's response, "She's my maid," over and over until they etched themselves into her bones. The pain wasn't just betrayal, it was annihilation. She had given him everything, her trust, her love, her body, her soul. And now, with new life forming inside her, he had abandoned her like a mistake he didn't want to claim. She spent the rest of the day staring at the white ceiling, numb and voiceless, while nurses drifted in and out, offering warm soup and sympathetic glances that couldn't reach her. She had no family to call, no friends to lean on, just silence, and the faint heartbeat of a child she hadn't even known was growing. In the deepest part of her spirit, a quiet fire sparked not of revenge, but of resolve. If Ethan Cross didn't have the strength to stand beside her, she would become her own pillar. She would not let her child grow up believing they were born from shame. She would rise from this betrayal not for him, but for the tiny heartbeat inside her that deserved a future filled with love, safety, and truth. Still, the ache in her chest throbbed like a wound that would never close. Ethan's face haunted her every blink. His voice echoed in the chambers of her heart, and that cold sentence, "She's my maid," burned across her soul like a brand. She sat alone in the hospital bed, holding the sonogram to her chest, knowing her world had just split in two before the betrayal and after. But beneath the crushing weight of his abandonment, something powerful stirred inside her, the first breath of a woman who had been broken but would not stay that way. As the dull ache of silence filled the hospital room, Amara sat motionless with the sonogram pressed to her chest, a quiet warrior mourning in solitude. Her eyes were dry now, not because she had no more tears to give, but because her soul had retreated inward, trying to protect itself from the avalanche of betrayal that had swallowed her just hours ago. But unknown to her, someone had been watching someone, who had seen not just the medical chart, but the humanity behind the trembling hands and tearless eyes. Dr. Julian Hartman, the hospital's founder and one of the most respected philanthropic billionaires in the city, had passed by her room during his morning rounds. At first, it was just another patient file, just another update in his bustling day. But something about the haunted silence within her room had made him pause. He'd lingered outside her door, overheard her whisper to herself, "He left me like I was nothing," and felt something inside him stir, something fierce, protective, and unfamiliar. He asked the nurse for her details not out of curiosity, but out of quiet concern. Over the next few days, he kept checking on her from afar, never disturbing her, just making sure she ate, making sure her vitals were steady, making sure someone, somewhere, still cared. He noticed she didn't have visitors. No family, no friends. Just her and the tiny heartbeat she clung to in the dark. On the third day, after watching her pick at her food in silence, Julian gently entered the room. Amara looked up, startled by the presence of a man in an elegant three-piece suit who didn't carry a clipboard or wear a name tag. His blue eyes were kind, but not pitying, and his voice was low and warm. "Hi, I'm Julian. I run this place," he said gently, pulling the chair close, but not too close. "I've seen you sitting here, alone, and I just wanted to ask, do you have anyone to help you through this?" Amara blinked, unsure if this was real or another illusion conjured by hope. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one." Julian studied her face, not the sadness, but the strength it took to hold it together. He could see the cracks, but also the courage. "You were betrayed," he said softly, "but that doesn't make you less worthy of love." That sentence, simple yet profound, lodged itself in her throat. She looked away, trying not to crumble. "Why are you saying this?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Julian leaned forward, his hands folded between his knees. "I don't need to know your whole story to see your dignity. The world breaks women like you and expects them to remain silent. But I don't believe you should be left to rebuild alone." Amara stared at him, unsure if he meant what he was implying. Julian hesitated for a moment, then with quiet certainty said the words that would shift the ground beneath her feet. "I'll marry you." Her breath caught in her chest. "What?" she said, almost laughing at the absurdity. "You don't even know my name." He smiled gently. "Your name is Amara. You're carrying life inside you. You've been left behind by someone who should have stood by you. And I don't believe the next chapter of your story should begin with loneliness." Silence blanketed the room. Amara stared at him, as if seeing something she didn't know could exist any more pure, unselfish kindness. She wanted to say no. She wanted to run. But the truth was she had nowhere to go. No money. No home. No plan. And here stood a man who wasn't touching her out of desire, but offering her protection wrapped in quiet honor. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. "Because I believe women like you deserve to rise again. You're not broken, Amara. You've just been wounded by someone too weak to carry the weight of love." Her lips quivered. She had nothing to offer him. No title. No background. Just herself and 3 lives growing quietly in her womb. And yet, she found herself whispering, "Okay." That one word shifted everything. Julian didn't reach for her. He didn't press further. He simply nodded with a soft smile and stood. "I'll make the arrangements, but know this isn't charity. I'm not saving you. I'm choosing you, because I believe in second chances. For both of us." In the weeks that followed, Amara was moved into a quiet countryside home Julian owned for rest and recovery. He never crossed boundaries, never treated her like property. He brought her warm food, books, and even helped paint the nursery when she hesitantly told him she was having triplets. They laughed, they sat in the garden watching sunsets, and over time, her body healed, but more importantly, her spirit began to trust again. Julian showed her what love looked like without expectation. His touch was respectful, his compliments rare but sincere. When she cried, he listened. When she doubted, he reminded her she was strong. And slowly, beneath his gentle presence, the pieces of her shattered identity began to stitch together into something whole again. She began smiling without fear, sleeping without tears, laughing without shame. And though she never forgot Ethan, the ache he left behind was no longer bleeding, it had become a scar she carried with quiet grace. Because this time, when she looked into the eyes of the man beside her, she didn't see lies or lust, she saw a future rooted in kindness. A future her children could grow into with pride. As autumn whispered through the trees and painted the leaves in amber and gold, Amara lay in the quiet stillness of a hospital delivery room. Her breaths labored but steady, her hands clutched tightly around Julian's as waves of pain surged through her body, reminding her that new life demanded sacrifice. Nurses moved efficiently, voices soft and calm, but her mind was loud with emotion, fear, hope, memories, and love, all colliding into one storm as the first cry rang out into the room like a trumpet of destiny. Then a second, and a third, 3 distinct cries, 3 heartbeats that once grew silently beneath her grief, now announcing themselves to the world like royalty born from brokenness. Julian's eyes were glossy as he stood beside her, watching in awe as the doctor carefully handed him a tiny, wrinkled baby boy with piercing blue eyes and a furrowed brow that mirrored a man he was not. "Eli," Amara whispered, breathless but smiling. Then came another boy, softer in features, his tiny fist curled like a warrior in training. "Elias," she named him, her voice trembling. And finally, a girl, the smallest of the 3, her cry shrill but brave, her lips already pouting with an expression far too familiar. "Ilara," Amara whispered, her voice cracking. They were perfect, ethereal, a holy trinity of life wrapped in the same face she once loved, a face that once abandoned her. But here, in this sacred room, that face no longer haunted Heret, was reborn in innocence, stripped of pain, and cradled in the arms of a man who never fathered them, but already loved them more than his own life. Julian held each child with trembling hands and a full heart, as though they were carved from his own spirit. He didn't flinch at their resemblance to Ethan. He didn't falter. Instead, he smiled through his tears and whispered, "I've waited my whole life for you 3. And in that moment, something inside Amara broke not from sorrow, but from overwhelming grace. This man, this billionaire, who could have had anyone, anywhere, had chosen her story, chosen her children. Julian didn't just sign a birth certificate, he wrote his devotion into their destiny with every diaper he changed, every lullaby he hummed, and every time he stood between them and the world like a guardian who had never known fear until now. Amara watched him pace with Ilara against his chest, his hand supporting her tiny head, while he whispered dreams of castles and stars into her ear. She saw him line the nursery with books, paint the walls himself, and insist that each child had their own crib. Even when they cried to be held together, Eli liked his chest the best, that calm instantly whenever Julian laid him against his heartbeat. Elias loved to grip his pinky and fall asleep mid-stretch, as if tethering himself to the giant he'd soon call Dad. Ilara, ever the fighter, only smiled when Julian sang her the off-key lullaby he wrote just for her. Amara began to heal not just from the pain of labor, but from the pain of memory. She no longer waited for texts that would never come, no longer searched her sons' faces for answers about a man who had walked away. The past was not her prison anymore, it was her proof. Proof that love could survive abandonment. Proof that motherhood could begin in heartbreak but blossom in hope. Julian built a world around her and the babies, a world where she didn't have to explain herself, where she didn't have to defend her worth. Her name was no longer tied to scandal, but to strength. Her laughter returned like a forgotten song, echoing through the halls of their estate as she danced barefoot in the nursery, holding Eli in one arm while Julian balanced Ilara and Elias, making funny faces until all 3 erupted in giggles. There were nights when Amara would sit by the fireplace and simply watch them, Julian reading to the triplets, their eyes heavy with sleep, his voice soft and warm. And in those moments, she realized she had been given more than a second chances, had been given justice wrapped in joy. Julian never once asked her about Ethan. He never questioned the past. He only reminded her of the present and built toward the future. He celebrated every milestone, the first time Eli rolled over, the first time Ilara said dada, the day Elias took 2 wobbly steps into his arms. Amara captured every moment in photographs, but more importantly, in memory, because for the first time in years, her life felt like her own. No longer living in someone else's shadow, no longer hoping for a door to open that had long been sealed shut. She was no longer Ethan Cross's maid, she was Julian Hartman's wife-in-waiting, the mother of 3 brilliant stars and the architect of her own legacy. Her babies didn't need Ethan's last name, they had Julian's love, and that was worth more than any inheritance. And as the triplets grew, crawling across marble floors and babbling with delight, Amara smiled at the life that had once seemed impossible and whispered to herself, This is what destiny feels like when love chooses you back. While Amara's world quietly flourished in the arms of gentle devotion across the city, beneath chandeliers of crystal and walls lined with privilege, Ethan Cross stood at the altar, with a woman society would have said fit him perfectly. Haley Monroe, his secretary, turned bride, wrapped in a designer gown and pride. Their wedding was the kind splashed across glossy magazines' white roses, cascading down a marble staircase, guests in tuxedos, a string quartet playing beneath golden lights, and champagne flowing like celebration had no memory. Ethan smiled in every photo, said all the right words, held Haley's hand with performance-worthy affection, but beneath the tailored suit and polished vows, something inside him felt misplaced. It wasn't guilt, at least that's what he told himself. Guilt requires acknowledgement. This was something more haunting-like, the faint scent of someone's perfume long after they've walked away, or the sudden quiet of a room that used to hum with laughter. Haley was beautiful, calculated, and efficient, a woman who fit the image his board members approved of, the kind of wife expected to stand beside a CEO at black-tie galas, not wipe tears from his mother's eyes or make soup when no one was watching. Their honeymoon was spent in Paris, but Ethan barely remembered the Eiffel Tower or the 5-star meals. His mind would wander at odd moments when a child laughed in the street or a waitress smiled with kindness instead of charm. He'd brush the thoughts away like cobwebs. It was just a phase, he told himself. She was just the maid. You made the right choice. But then came the dreams, vivid ones. Dreams of warm brown eyes looking at him with trust. Dreams of laughter that didn't need music. Dreams of a soft voice whispering, I believe in you, as hands touched his fessno out of obligation, but love. He'd wake up beside Haley, staring at the ceiling, haunted by eyes that no longer belonged to him. Haley noticed, of course. She wasn't blind. She'd watch him during breakfast, eyes distant as if chasing a memory. You okay? She'd ask, sipping her espresso. Just work. He'd lie. But even when he held her, even when their bodies met in the dark, there was no fire, only shadows, trying to mimic what he once felt without effort. At charity events, when donors brought their children, Ethan found himself staring too long at the toddlers with thick curls or brown skin, wondering if any of them looked like what his child might have looked like. One afternoon, at a city park opening, he passed a young mother sitting beneath a tree, her daughter curled up in her lap. The child turned and her deep brown eyes met his for a second. Ethan froze. His lungs stalled. His heart stuttered. It wasn't Amara. It wasn't his child. But it could have been. And that brief flicker of imagined fatherhood left him shaken. At home, he found himself wandering into the guest bedroom, the one Haley had tried to turn into a fitness room. He sat on the edge of the untouched bed and imagined what it might have looked like, filled with toys, with laughter, with 3 little faces running to him yelling, "Daddy!" But the room remained silent. He tried to bury the ache in business deals, in board meetings, in trips to Dubai and Shanghai. He spoiled Haley with jewelry, took her to galas, smiled for the cameras, but when he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. His smile never quite reached his eyes anymore, and the mansion, once his pride, now echoed with a strange emptiness that even surround sound speakers couldn't fill. Haley became frustrated. "You're not present," she snapped during dinner one night. "You're here, but you're not here." He had no answer. How could he explain that the ghost of a woman he left behind had taken up permanent residence in his soul? That sometimes, When it rained, he remembered the way her fingers brewed coffee, or how she tucked his mother's blanket with such tenderness it made him believe love was a verb, not a status. One night, after too many drinks, he found himself scrolling through old security footage, those mundane days when Amara walked the hallways, adjusting flowers, humming quietly as she wiped the stair railing. He watched one clip where she paused at the grand piano and ran her fingers across the dust, smiling softly to herself. It broke him. He turned off the screen, face buried in his hands, breath ragged. For the first time, he whispered her name aloud. Amara. Just once. Just enough to remind himself that he had once held something sacred and let it go for appearances. He didn't know where she was. He hadn't dared to look. Pride had welded his ego shut, but the ache was real, and the regret wasn't subtle anymore. It was growing, blooming like a thorned vine around his chest. Haley noticed the change, the lingering silences, the tightened jaw, the way he avoided baby aisles in department stores. He'd gone numb to his own curated life. And while the world still applauded his success, Ethan Cross knew, deep down, that he had already failed in the only place that ever truly mattered: love. As Ethan wandered the hollow halls of his mansion, chasing echoes of a love he discarded, across the city, another man was building a monument, not of wealth but of honor. Julian stood at the edge of a vast construction site, sunlight bathing the skeletal frame of what would soon become the most iconic destination in the city. Steel beams reached for the sky like ambition reborn, and behind every blueprint and foundation stone was a single purpose: to give Amara the throne the world had once denied her. He had named it without hesitation, without needing her approval, because it wasn't just a gift, it was a declaration. Amara's Grace, the sign read, etched in gold above towering glass doors that shimmered like a jewel in the heart of downtown. When he revealed it to her, Amara stood speechless on the sidewalk, her triplets cradled in her arms, her eyes wide as she read the name again and again, her soul catching up to the gravity of what Julian had done. This can't be real," she whispered. But Julian simply smiled, brushing a loose braid behind her ear. "You are not someone's leftover, Amara. You're not a secret to be hidden or a name to be forgotten. You're a queen, and this city will never erase you again." Her knees nearly buckled under the weight of it, not the mall, not the grandeur, but the respect. No man had ever spoken to her like that. Not even Ethan, in his sweetest moments, had seen her as more than a fleeting feeling. But Julian had seen her broken, saw her rise, and now he was giving her a skyline. "You built this for me?" she asked, her voice quivering. "For the woman you are," he replied. "For the woman the world tried to bury but couldn't." As the mall neared completion, the media buzzed about the mysterious investor, the storybook rise of a black woman whose name now gleamed above a luxury empire. But it wasn't just about luxury, it was a symbol. The mall was designed with elegant art, eco-conscious technology, and a central atrium where a golden statue of a mother holding 3 children stood, Talon, unspoken echo of Amara and the legacy she now carried. Amara poured herself into the opening, overseeing every detail with quiet grace. She hired women from underprivileged backgrounds, gave single mothers executive roles, built childcare centers inside the mall for working parents, and insisted that every boutique give back to the community in some form. "If I've learned anything," she said during a board meeting, "it's that power means nothing unless it lifts others." She became more than a name. She became a movement. Her face graced magazine covers not for scandal, but for empowerment. Bloggers wrote think pieces titled "From Maid to Mogul," and young women of color whispered her name in salons, classrooms, and coffee shops with pride. Mothers told their daughters, "You can be like Amara." When the mall's grand opening arrived, the city showed up in thousands. Cameras flashed, influencers live-streamed, politicians clapped from the crowd. But Amara didn't care about any of that. She stood at the center of it all, in an emerald green gown that shimmered under the lights, holding Julian's hand on one side and her triplets on the other, and smiled like someone who had finally exhaled the pain of years gone by. Julian leaned in and whispered, "They're not just here for the mall. They're here for you." She knew he was right. When she stepped to the mic, the crowd silenced. She looked out at the sea of faces and felt the tremble in her knees steady. "5 years ago," she began, "I was abandoned, broken, and forgotten. But I stand here not because I was rescued, but because I refused to stay down. Because a good man saw the ashes and believed something beautiful could rise from them." Her voice cracked slightly as she glanced at Julian, then down at her babies, who stared up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "This mall isn't about me. It's about every woman who's been called not enough. It's about turning heartbreak into heritage. This is for all of us." The applause was thunderous, but her heart stayed calm, grounded. As she stepped away from the mic, a little girl in the front row reached up and handed her a handmade bracelet. "You're my hero," she whispered. Amara bent down and hugged her, the tears finally escaping in soft, silent waves. Later that evening, long after the lights dimmed and the cameras packed away, Amara stood on the top balcony of the mall, looking out at the city that once overlooked her. Julian wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "So," he whispered, "how does it feel to be royalty?" She laughed through her tears. "It feels like I finally remember who I am." And as the wind carried her laughter across the city skyline, Amara knew that her story had shifted. She was no longer the girl who had been left behind. She was the woman who had risen from the ashes, built an empire, and turned her pain into power. As the final echoes of applause faded into the night air outside Amara's grace, and Amara stood on the rooftop balcony basking in the winds of her victory, across town, in a sleek penthouse filled with dim lights and empty laughter, Ethan Cross reclined on his leather couch, flipping lazily through television channels until a local news broadcast caught his eye. The anchor's voice chirped with enthusiasm. In today's top business feature, the city welcomes a revolutionary new landmark, the grand opening of Amara's Gracer Luxury Mall with a powerful story behind its name. Ethan blinked, then smirked, amused by the coincidence. "Look, babe," he called out, waving Haley over with a chuckle. "Someone actually named a mall after my ex-maid." Haley padded over in silk pajamas, wineglass in hand, her lips curling into a grin. "You're kidding," she said, sliding next to him on the couch. "Nope, I swear it." Ethan laughed, rewinding the segment. "Same name, Amara. That girl used to mop my marble floors, and now some guy out there probably used her name as a gimmick to sound poetic." They both erupted into cruel, careless laughter, completely unaware that they were mocking a woman who had risen from their rejection and now stood higher than either of them could imagine. "She must have inspired some rich sucker," Haley joked, sipping her wine. "Or maybe she's running a juice stand at the entrance." Ethan nearly spit out his drink. That'd be her speed. Their mockery filled the room like cheap perfume, loud, clinging, unearned. The newscast continued, showing drone footage of the mall, highlighting its marble atrium, green rooftops, and a glittering name sign stretching across the skyline. "Amara's Grace is not just a mall," the reporter continued. "It's a beacon of empowerment built by the mysterious billionaire Julian Hartman and his wife, a black woman with a story of pain turned to power." Ethan's laughter died mid-chuckle, his brow furrowed slightly. "Julian Hartman," he repeated. "That name rings a bell." Haley waved it off. Probably another flashy investor trying to stay relevant. But Ethan's attention was locked now, his fingers tightening around the remote as the screen zoomed in on the unveiling ceremony. The image paused, just long enough to capture Amara radiant in her emerald gown, standing hand in hand with Julian, their triplets bundled beside them. Ethan's body went rigid, his breath stalled, the glass in his hand tilted, spilling red wine onto his cream shirt, but he didn't even notice. "Wait," he whispered. "That's her." Haley blinked. "Who?" That's Amara." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Haley's laughter faded. "That can't be. She looks different." "No," Ethan murmured, eyes locked on the screen as if hypnotized. "That's her. I'd know that face anywhere." The footage cut to Amara speaking at the podium, her voice strong and serene. "I was once invisible. Now I am seen." Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. The babies. The billionaire. the power, the grace. His Ammirano, not his any war, had become a woman he no longer recognized, not because she had changed, but because she had finally become who she was always meant to be. "She's married to Julian Hartman?" Haley asked, her voice thinning with unease. Ethan nodded slowly, eyes glued to the screen, blood draining from his face. "And those kids?" He trailed off as the camera panned down to the three little ones who mirrored his eyes, his jawline, his exact skin tone, blend undeniable echoes of a legacy he had denied. Haley turned pale. "Are they?" "They're mine," Ethan whispered. "Those are my kids." The wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering across the hardwood floor. But he didn't flinch. Every breath he took now tasted like ashes. The laughter from 10 minutes ago felt like poison he had swallowed. "Oh my God," Haley whispered, standing up slowly, as if trying to escape the truth, cracking through the television screen. Ethan stood, stumbling back from the couch, eyes wide in disbelief. "She told me she was pregnant, at the hospital, and He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The memory hit him like a tidal wave, the sterile hallway, Amara's tear-stained face, the doctor's words, "Congratulations, your wife is pregnant." And his own voice, the lie, he spoke with cold precision. "She's not my wife. She's my maid." Those words echoed in his head now like a curse. "She wasn't lying," Ethan gasped. I walked away from them. Haley's hands trembled as she reached for the remote to shut off the screen, but it was too late. The damage was done. Reality had arrived like a storm crashing through their glass tower. Ethan stumbled to the window, gripping the edge of the frame, looking out at the distant skyline where the letters Amara's Grace now glowed like judgment across the night. "I left her with nothing," he whispered, "and she built everything." The silence in the room grew thick with the weight of what they could never undo. In the distance, Amara laughed joyfully into a microphone, bathed in flashing lights and surrounded by people who celebrated her, while Ethan stood in his penthouse haunted, hollow, and heartbroken. The storm hadn't hit yet, but its winds were beginning to howl. The skyline shimmered under a golden sunset as the city buzzed with a quiet hum, unaware that destiny was preparing to place two broken worlds on a collision course. Inside Amara's Grace, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation as elegant banners fluttered across every glass wall, announcing a surprise anniversary celebration. 5 years of love, leadership, and legacy. The mall, already packed with weekend shoppers, felt more electric than usual as murmurs spread through the crowd about a massive, one-day 50% sale offered by the mysterious couple who had changed the face of the city. Store employees handed out roses to children, musicians played jazz in the central atrium, and a charismatic manager took the microphone with a grin that stirred curiosity like fire. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing through the luxurious mall, "on this very special day, our beloved owners are not just celebrating their marriage, they're sharing their joy with every one of you. Please stay with us because in just a few minutes, the heart of Amara's Grace will walk through those doors." Cheers erupted, cameras lifted. Curious customers paused their shopping, gathering near the center fountain wrapped in golden ribbons. And amidst the crowd stood Ethan Cross and Haley Monroe, unaware that fate had just written their names into the evening script. Haley flipped through a rack of designer dresses, distracted, while Ethan mindlessly checked his phone, his nerves still tangled from the discovery he couldn't shake. They hadn't planned to visit this mall. Haley had insisted on checking out the hyped-up place with good sales, and Ethan, craving distraction, had followed. But now, as they stood frozen near the event space, the words, "owners arriving soon," looped in Ethan's mind like a warning bell. He couldn't explain why his heart beat so loud or why his palms felt damp. Haley nudged him. "You want to wait and see? Might be some rich influencers or fashion bloggers." Ethan forced a nod, the echo of last night's newscast pulsing behind his eyes. The crowd grew thicker. Children sat on parents' shoulders. Phones hovered high in the air. The jazz faded into silence, and then two luxury black limousines pulled up outside the mall's grand entrance. The glass doors slid open. The atmosphere shifted. Like royalty arriving home, Julian Hartman stepped out first in a sleek navy suit, his hand outstretched, offering his strength to a woman whose presence made the room gasp. Amara emerged in a white satin gown with gold detailing, her braids woven with pearls, her posture straight, radiant, and commanding. She looked not like a survivor, but a queen returning to her throne. On either side of her walked her 3 children, Eli, Elias, and Ilara, dressed in matching formal wear, their presence alone igniting whispers across the crowd. The resemblance was undeniable. Gasps rippled, cameras snapped. The triplets didn't just look like her, they looked like someone else too. Ethan's breath caught mid-air, his legs locked beneath him. Haley turned to ask him something, but when she followed his frozen gaze and laid eyes on the family entering the mall, her jaw slackened. "Wait, is that?" she stammered. Ethan couldn't speak. His throat had dried to sand. His mind screamed, but his voice betrayed him. There she washes past, his mistake, his consequence, walking confidently beside a man who had done what he couldn't. "Stay." Julian leaned down and kissed Amara's hand before leading their children up the red-carpeted path toward the stage where a massive floral arch awaited them. "Welcome, everyone," the manager cheered. "Tonight we celebrate 5 years of unstoppable love between Julian Hartman and his extraordinary wife, Amara." The crowd roared. Ethan's knees buckled. He gripped a pillar for support. His eyes darted between the children, their smiles, their eyes eye sand. The truth became a blade he couldn't dodge. "Those are mine," he whispered, finally voicing the guilt that had been choking him. "Those are my kids." Haley stared at him like he had just confessed to a crime. "What?" she breathed. "You said she lied. You said she never lied," Ethan muttered, eyes glistening. "I did." The words cut deeper than any silence ever could. The world around him faded as he saw Amara hold a mic, her voice clear, proud, and unshaken. "5 years ago, I walked into a hospital alone," she said. "But I didn't leave alone. I left with 3 miracles, and the man who chose to love me when I had nothing." The audience applauded, unaware of the emotional hurricane happening just feet away. "This mall," she continued, "is not just bricks and glass. It's my truth, my home, my triumph." Ethan staggered forward, as if pulled by invisible strings, his heart bursting with unspoken apologies. But security stopped him. Haley grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "Fixing a mistake," he whispered. "Or at least trying." But as he watched Amara lean down and kiss her children, as Julian wrapped an arm around her waist and held her like she was the only woman in the universe, Ethan finally saw it. This was no longer his story. This was hers. And she had rewritten the ending without him. The applause still thundered in the background when a sleek, obsidian-black limousine curved around the mall's marble driveway like a whisper of destiny approaching. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence so regal it made the crowd instinctively hold their breath. The red carpet rolled out in front of the doors as security cleared a path, murmurs slicing through the mall like wildfire. Ethan, still stunned, turned his head toward the entrance, and the moment his eyes locked on the arriving vehicle, his stomach twisted into knots, so tight it nearly folded him in half. The limo door opened with smooth precision, and flashes from paparazzi cameras exploded like fireworks against twilight. Out stepped Amara, glowing like a celestial being in a floor-length white designer dress that shimmered under the glass roof like moonlight incarnate. Her shoulders held high, her face carved with elegance and calm power. She moved with the grace of someone who had nothing to prove, but everything to show. Her arm was linked tightly with Julian's, who stood beside her in a charcoal suit trimmed with gold, his posture confident but deferential, like a king willingly walking beside a queen. Then came the bombshell that made hearts skip beats and turned whispers into collective gasps. The children, Eli, Elias, and Ilara, stepped down in matching formal black attire, their shoes polished, their curls perfectly styled, their eyes wide and full of innocence. But it wasn't just their outfits or their perfect behavior that silenced the crowd, it was their faces. 3 identical bursts of undeniable truth. Ethan saw it. The whole city saw it. The sharp line of the jaw, the icy blue hue blending with warm brown, the unmistakable curvature of their cheekbones. was as if someone had printed Ethan's DNA across 3 tiny humans and handed them to another man to raise. His knees buckled. His heart didn't just pound, it convulsed. He reached out to the pillar beside him, gripping it like a man trying not to drown in a sea of public revelation. Haley, standing beside him in stiletto heels and silent horror, turned sheet white as she stared at the children, her jaw hanging open, lips trembling. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Ethan, they look exactly like you." But Ethan couldn't speak. His tongue felt glued to the back of his dry throat, his chest aching under the weight of the scene unraveling before his eyes. The irony was cruel. He had spent 5 years denying them, burying memories under status and silence, only to see the truth unveiled like a headline in front of hundreds of strangers. Amara walked gracefully past the crowd, the triplets holding her gown's hem like royal pages. She didn't look around, didn't flinch at the flashes or gasps. But as she passed Ethan, her eyes flicked upward for one singular second, their gazes locked. The world stopped. Her look wasn't cold. It wasn't vengeful. It was silent, powerful, final. A message written without words. You made your choice. That one glance shattered Ethan more than any slap ever could. Julian noticed, of course. He gently placed his hand on the small of Amara's back, guiding her forward not in possession, but in partnership. Together, they and the children walked up to the golden anniversary stage as a string quartet began to play softly in the background. The audience erupted in applause, completely unaware of the emotional battlefield unraveling just feet away. Ethan's legs gave in. He stumbled backward into a bench, burying his face in his hands as the truth finally detonated. These were his children, his blood, and they walked right past him, holding another man's hand. Haley sat beside him, visibly shaking, tears forming in her mascara-rimmed eyes. "You lied to me," she whispered. "You told me she was just some phase, a mistake. But that," she pointed, voice quivering, "that's not a mistake. That's your family." Ethan couldn't even deny it anymore. Not to her, not to himself. He had let go of diamonds while chasing polished stones. He had traded real love for image, traded soul for strategy, and now he was nothing but an outsider to the life that could have been his. All he could do now was watch as the crowd showered Amara and Julian with admiration, as Eli clutched his mother's hand and whispered something that made her laugh, as Ilara handed her father a single rose and he kissed her forehead, as Elias clapped when Julian kissed Amara gently in front of the cameras. And Ethan? He was no longer the CEO in command. He was just a man watching the world he gave up bloom without him. The applause still echoed as the spotlight settled on the stage, but Ethan no longer heard any of this. World had gone silent, consumed by the sound of his heartbeat pounding like war drums in his ears. With eyes red and brimming with tears, he pushed himself up from the bench, his limbs heavy with shame, his chest aching with a truth he could no longer ignore. Somewhere in the crowd, a few murmured his name as they recognized the once proud CEO stumbling toward the stage. But Ethan didn't care about the whispers, the cameras, or his ruined reputation. He only saw her, Amara, standing tall beside Julian, wrapped in elegance and dignity, their children flanking them like living reminders of the love he discarded. Each step Ethan took forward felt like wading through the wreckage of his own decisions. The security guards instantly stepped in, their arms raised to block him, but Ethan's voice cracked through the chaos like a wounded plea. "Please," he choked, "let me speak to her, just once." The lead guard glanced at Amara, waiting for instruction. She didn't blink, she didn't flinch, but after a brief pause, she raised one graceful hand, signaling the guards to stand down. The tension in the air coiled tighter as Ethan crossed the final few feet of marble floor, then collapsed to his knees before her, like a man stripped of pride, dignity, and delusion. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but his voice trembled louder with each word. "I'm sorry, Amara. I made the biggest mistake of my life." She looked down at him, her face unreadable, a portrait of strength molded from years of pain and growth. Julian stood silently at her side, a quiet pillar of support, saying nothing but watching with sharp, protective eyes. I didn't know what I had, Ethan continued, his hands pressed together in supplication. I was stupid, blind. I cared more about what the world thought than what my heart knew. I see it now. You were never just a maid. You were my peace, my light. And I threw it away. His voice cracked completely as tears streamed freely down his cheeks. Please, Amara. Please, just give me another chance. I want to be in their lives. I want to know my children. I want to be the man I should have been back then. The crowd hushed. The camera zoomed in. The moment stretching endlessly, like time itself was holding its breath. Amara stared at him not with bitterness, not with hate, but with a silence so composed. It shook him deeper than any scream. Her eyes glistened with something he couldn't quite name, perhaps not pain, but memory. She slowly stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble, then knelt gracefully to meet him at eye level. The two of them, once lovers tangled in whispered promises, now faced each other in a moment that would define them both forever. Ethan, she said gently, when you left me at that hospital, I begged too. I begged you to stay. I begged you to believe me. I cried for nights, holding on to a dream that you'd walk through those doors. But you didn't, and I died every day in silence while carrying the children you swore you never made. Her voice didn't shake, it soared. I gave you my heart when it was whole, and you shattered it without warning. But do you know what's worse than heartbreak? Becoming invisible to someone you once meant everything to. Ethan sobbed quietly, nodding, unable to form words. Amara gently reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek knot. His, her own. I forgive you, she said, and the room gasped. But then she added, not for you, for me, because I refuse to carry your guilt on my shoulders any longer. But forgiveness is not an invitation. You don't get a second chance to break what I spent years rebuilding. Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled back slowly, gracefully. These children are loved, she said. They're protected. They have a father, one who didn't run when things got hard, one who chose them before even knowing them, one who chose me. Julian stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, and Amara leaned into his touch like a tree bends towards sunlight. You may have given them life, she said softly, but he gave them love. Ethan lowered his head, sobbing into his palms, broken beyond repair. The crowd, once buzzing with curiosity, now stood still in awe, witnessing not a scandal but a lesson. A woman who had once been abandoned now stood taller than her pain, defending her peace, her children, and her power without anger, only truth. Your chapter in my life, she said, standing once more, is closed. And with that, she turned away, her children rushing toward her, embracing her waist, their tiny arms wrapping around her like armor. Julian reached down, lifting Alara into his arms, and the family walked away, unshaken, untouchable, unstoppable. Ethan remained on his knees long after they disappeared into the celebration, a man who had everything and lost it all not because it was taken, but because he let it go. Ethan still knelt on the cold marble floor, tears dripping silently down his face. But the moment had already moved beyond him, his pain now, a distant echo in the thunderous rhythm of Amara's triumph. She stood center stage, no longer just a woman who had been left behind, but a force of resilience wrapped in grace. The golden lights bathed her in brilliance as the cameras swiveled toward her, capturing a moment the city would never forget. Her fingers gently curled around the microphone, and her voice steady, proud, unshaken rose above the hush like a song long buried beneath grief. Once upon a time, she began, her eyes never leaving Ethan's crumpled figure. You said you loved me, but you only loved the way I made you feel. You adored my beauty, but ignored my soul. You held my body, but dropped my heart. A pause. Then she turned toward the sea of strangers, turned witnesses, and continued. When life broke me open, you left me bleeding on hospital tiles, pregnant and terrified, and you vanished into silence. Her voice didn't tremble, it soared. But this man, she turned to Julian and reached for his hand, her fingers locking around his with reverence. This man found me in my darkest hour, not to use me, but to lift me, not to own me, but to honor me, not to whisper empty promises, but to stand beside me and build a kingdom where I was queen, not a secret. Julian's eyes glistened, his smile soft and full of pride. The children smiled beside them, Eli brushing a tear from his cheek, as if even he knew the power of the moment his mother was stepping into. Amara looked back toward Ethan, her expression calm, not cold, not cruel, but final. You see, Ethan, my heart no longer cries for you. It no longer searches empty rooms hoping you'll return. It no longer aches for the what-ifs or drowns in the could-have-beens. My heart now celebrates what I've become. She turned back toward the crowd, lifting her chin higher. I am not just a maid who was forgotten. I am a mother who rose. I am a woman of worth. I am proof that abandonment cannot erase destiny. The audience erupted in applause, the sound of it vibrating through glass, rising like waves crashing against the cliffs of silence. People stood to their feet, clapping not just for her words, but for her spirit, for surviving, for rising, for becoming more than anyone had expected. Julian turned to her, eyes filled with the kind of love that didn't need speeches. Amara leaned forward, and in front of the world, she kissed his hand gently, like a queen honoring the king who never let go. The cameras flashed like lightning, capturing the kiss, the children, the soft smile on Julian's lips, and the strength in Amara's eyes. Somewhere behind the curtain of celebration, Ethan sat on the floor, ruined by regret, a man left behind by time, haunted by truth, and drowning in the echo of a name he once called mine. But it no longer belonged to him. Amara was no longer his anything, she was her everything. As she turned to leave the stage, Julian wrapped his arm around her, and together they walked down the steps, surrounded by their children, their heads held high. Reporters tried to push forward, but security formed a respectful barrier, as if even the world knew this moment was sacred. Outside, the streets echoed with celebration. Screens across the city replayed her speech. Social media erupted with hashtags like #Queen Amara and #Woman of Worth. Women across the city shared their own stories, inspired by her voice. Young girls pointed at the television and said, I want to be like her. Amara stepped into the limo once more, now not as a guest in someone else's world, but the architect of her own. Inside, Julian gently pressed his forehead to hers, whispering, You were always worthy. She smiled through tears that no longer came from pain, but from healing. As the limo pulled away, the crowd outside still clapped, chanting her name like an anthem. And in the center of it all, one truth burned brighter than ever. Amara Bennett was no longer the woman Ethan abandoned. She was the woman who rose, the woman who ruled, the woman who chose love over bitterness and power over pity. She was the woman who turned heartbreak into a headline of hope. And now the whole world knew her worth. Amara never begged for love. She became love. And in a world that judged her by status, she let her strength write her story.